Welcome to Mill Prologues. It is with great excitement that we bring our 86th season to a close by celebrating the legacy of Danish author Hans Christian Andersen and one of his most famous fairy tales, The Little Mermaid, a story that continues to delight generations of children and adults. The goal of Prologues is to give our audience an extra layer of insight and context for our productions by exploring some of the themes, histories, and cultural relevance behind each show. What we provide is by no means exhaustive, and we encourage you to continue to explore any topics we raise here on your own. You can also reference our works cited list at the end of the video to dig even deeper. In this video, we'll explore the enduring power of folklore and fairy tales, and what made Andersen a master of storytelling.
Folklore consists of various styles of short storytelling, including folktales, fables, myths, legends, and fairy tales. Historically, fairy tales were mostly constructed as vehicles to convey universal truths and moral lessons to readers and listeners. They utilize magical creatures, animals, and non-human characters that can be easily associated with certain characteristics, such as good and evil. Some communities use these stories to enforce specific values, morals, and beliefs. Common formulas, such as the narrative structure of the monomyth or the hero's journey, appear in countless popular stories, from the Odyssey, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and The Wizard of Oz. Familiar character archetypes such as the trickster show up in almost every region's fictional tales, from the West African spider figure Anansi to the mythological Puck in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. These similar tropes, characters, and plot lines speak to a shared human experience, and these themes continue to resonate in the stories we tell today. Folklore traditions have progressed over centuries, beginning with oral narratives passed down through generations and eventually becoming the foundation for written literature. In fact, the origin of fairy tales traces back over thousands of years, potentially 6,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. Beloved stories such as Beauty and the Beast, Rumpelstiltskin, and Jack and the Beanstalk all have core narratives sourced from ancient myths and folklore that have evolved into the stories we recognize today. The first literary fairy tale, Cupid and Psyche, appeared as early as the 2nd century AD. A century later came the Panchatantra, a series of interwoven Indian fables written in Sanskrit, which would influence future European fairy tales. In France, the fairy tale tradition became particularly popular among the upper class in the late 17th century, and in 1697, writer Charles Perrault's Cendrillon introduced the fairy godmother, pumpkin carriage, and glass slipper, becoming the Cinderella story widely retold in Western culture. Interestingly, the United States has not been known to have many examples of traditional fairy tales. However, through the 18th and 19th centuries, American tall tales and legendary figures such as Johnny Appleseed, Paul Bunyan, and John Henry became essential stories to the American literary canon. The period that solidified the global impact of fairy tales began in the early 19th century, when the Brothers Grimm published their collection of folklore. They popularized stories including Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White, recognizing the deep cultural significance of Germanic tales and seeking to preserve their integrity through their collection. The Smith and the Devil, included in an earlier edition of the Grimm's Children's and Household Tales, is recognized as the oldest fairy tale, estimating its origins around 6,000 years ago, further supporting the evolution of oral storytelling to literature. Hans Christian Andersen also began writing in the early 19th century. However, unlike the Brothers Grimm, Andersen created his own tales, though he still applied certain tropes and themes of traditional folklore. But Andersen's unique contribution to literature lay in his enduring connection to childhood. He had the ability to endow inanimate objects with life and personality, an innately childlike quality that he maintained throughout his life and work. He cultivated this power, and as one critic wrote, "The child spoke through him." One reason for Andersen's great appeal to both children and adults is that he was not afraid of introducing feelings and ideas that others might perceive as beyond a child's immediate comprehension. Andersen placed his characters in desperate and hopeless situations to reflect his own personal traumas, which included being raised in poverty, losing his father, and having to work in a factory at age 11 to support his mother. Throughout his life, he perceived himself as an outsider, and despite the international recognition he received, he never felt completely accepted. He suffered deeply, but was able to transform his pain into art. Much like the Ugly Duckling, Andersen only later in life became the Swan, a cultured, world-renowned writer with friends in high places. Andersen even admitted of the Ugly Duckling, "This story is, of course, a reflection of my own life." Literary critic Paul Binding said, "The long-lasting appeal of his stories go beyond their authenticity." He wrote, "True, some of Andersen's most famous stories, The Ugly Duckling, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, even The Little Mermaid, are dramatizations or sublimations of his own dilemmas, but they would not work on us as they do if they did not transcend the personal, in language, in observation and detail, and in intricate but unobtrusive structure, to stand on their own as perfectly wrought artifacts of universal appeal." His stories continue to be rewritten and adapted over the last century and a half, providing new generations of children with tales of loneliness and belonging. The musical Honk is a recent reimagining of The Ugly Duckling. Andersen's The Princess and the Pea was adapted into Once Upon a Mattress, a musical that exemplifies what it means to be one's unique, authentic self without shame. Disney's Frozen, loosely based on Andersen's The Snow Queen, also celebrates the unique gifts that make us special. Andersen's tales are meant to inspire introspection, commiseration, and empathy. And theater is a tool for empathy, an art form that provides an opportunity to walk in another's shoes, to view an experience outside of your own, but that can, at the same time, provide a reflection of one's life. It is no wonder that Andersen's work so beautifully translates into musical theater. These characters' search for belonging is so emotionally charged that to express themselves through song makes perfect sense. While the story of The Little Mermaid that we know today came from Andersen, he drew inspiration from the novella Undine and the French legend of Melusine. And beyond these stories, there are many myths and legends of mermaids or similar sea creatures from a variety of cultures, from Selkies and Scottish tales to the saltwater mermaids known as Jai Murdiwa from indigenous Australian stories. We see merfolk appear over and over again. Even the beloved tale of The Little Mermaid has been adapted and retold over the years and across cultures. Part of the magic of The Little Mermaid and all fairy tales is how we relate to them. Though they often center magical, dreamlike lands and fantastical events, and they lure us in with glitter and illusion, they still ultimately speak to real life. They offer morals and lessons that we carry with us when we return to reality. For generations, we've used storytelling to pass down shared knowledge, teach morals, and to understand each other better. And that is truly where Andersen's legacy lies, in stories that help us to understand one another, stories that help us to understand that we are not alone in our experiences, stories that help us to understand that we take the good with the bad, that we can learn from our mistakes and traumas and find strength in that shared humanity which ultimately allows us to recognize that we, like the Ugly Duckling, can each become our own swan, just as Andersen, through turning pain into art, ultimately found the recognition he so justly deserved. When he was in his late 60s, the Danish government declared Andersen a national treasure. They subsequently paid him a stipend and constructed a statue of the author in the King's Garden in Copenhagen to commemorate his 70th birthday. Andersen lived to see that birthday, but died 4 months later. Over a century later, you can still see tributes to the writer's legacy in cities around the world, including a second statue of Andersen in Copenhagen along the street named after him, and the famous sculpture of the Little Mermaid at Langelinie Pier.
Thank you for joining us for this final show of our season, a show that reminds us of the power of storytelling and that encourages us to keep viewing the world with childlike wonder. And thank you for continuing to allow Paper Mill Playhouse to be a part of your world. Enjoy the show, and we'll see you next season.